Let's get some more analysis, and we can speak now to John Curtice, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. It was a 3-hour grilling today. What did we find out?
Well, we found out two things. We found out one thing about the committee. Those of us who have listened to and occasionally been a witness before a select committee of MPs would normally find that each of the MPs would pursue their own individual questions, their own individual agendas, rather than operating collectively. This was a committee that was operating very, very much collectively. They had agreed the questions amongst themselves, they shared them out amongst themselves, but they pursued the argument in a very systematic and rigorous fashion. So that perhaps was one bit of bad news for the Prime Minister. So far as his defence is concerned, I think probably it's going to be very difficult for the committee to argue that on the basis of the evidence we've heard that he intentionally misled the House of Commons. Mr. Johnson's admitted he misled the House of Commons. The question is why he did so. We might have the committee might have doubts about whether or not his understanding of the guidance on the COVID pandemic and what could or could not be allowed was perhaps a debatable interpretation, but I think they're going to find it difficult to argue that he intentionally misled the House. The criterion under which he does seem potentially to be vulnerable is the criterion of recklessness. And there are two reasons why that criterion might result in the committee criticising him. The first is that Mr. Johnson was effectively had to acknowledge this afternoon that in following the guidance, they followed the guidance within the limitations of what they thought was possible within number 10 Downing Street, which is a bit of a rabbit warren of a building with lots of small rooms, which did not necessarily allow social distancing to be followed in full, as the guidance would ideally recommend. And the committee may therefore feel that Mr. Johnson, in simply saying that all guidance was followed, was perhaps going further than he could actually reasonably have said. But the second reason why he's potentially in trouble, and I think this is where perhaps the committee seemed to be potentially most critical, was saying that the assurances that he said he had that indeed all rules and regulations had been followed, those assurances came primarily from two of his political appointees, including his communications chief. They did not come from the cabinet secretary. The committee was doubtful that he had much advice in that direction from any senior civil servant, and certainly didn't have any advice to that direction from a lawyer. In other words, whether or not Mr. Johnson had sought sufficient assurances from suitably qualified people to give the assurances that he did to the House, that perhaps is where the committee might criticise him and might therefore regard that as being a reckless misleading of the House. Now, we have to wait and see. There's no guarantee that's the way in which the committee will see it. But that was certainly the line of criticism where the committee certainly seemed to be directing a significant number of their questions, particularly towards the end of the afternoon.
Yeah, Johnson sounding very defensive and combative as the hearing went on. He called it a kangaroo court. That's, of course, despite the presence of members of his own party on the committee. He also tried blaming the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, saying, if he was aware of what was going on in Downing Street, then Rishi Sunak was as well. I mean, sounds a bit desperate, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, on the Mr. Sunak point, of course, Mr. Sunak got fined because he turned up at an event, which I think was Mr. Johnson's birthday party, and of course, didn't demur. He participated, although he thought he was just simply turning up for a meeting. But yes, I mean, one of the lines of that Mr. Johnson tried was, look, if the guidance was being followed, then there were an awful lot of other people in 10 Downing Street, including honourable civil servants, who also felt that we were following the rules. And to that extent, at least, yes, Mr. Johnson was trying to spread the blame more widely. I think, in fairness to Mr. Johnson, he demurred from the idea that this was a kangaroo court, although he did reserve judgment as to whether or not he's going to be treated fairly by the committee. I think if the committee criticises, he may decide he hasn't been treated fairly. Okay. But I think, in truth, again, coming back to what I said earlier about the committee, this committee operated on a cross-party basis this afternoon. And to that extent, and the truth is, he was most irritated, I think, by one of the Conservative members on the committee, Sir Bernard Jenkin, who has a certain wry style to him, and I think that got under Mr. Johnson's skin. So I think the truth is, it wasn't clear that this was the kangaroo court led by opposition MPs. This was very much a cross-party grilling.
Sure, we're almost out of time. I just want to ask you really quickly, though, before we wrap up, because, of course, people saying Boris Johnson's political future is going to be determined by this hearing. How long are we going to have to wait to find out just what the findings are?
Well, it could be. I think we're probably into months rather than weeks. Though I think one has to say, even before today, Mr. Johnson's career as a senior political figure in Britain is already over. He was thrown out of office by his colleagues because they can no longer trust what he said. The truth is, the public no longer trust what he says. That combination is fatal for any prospects that he might still have for trying to come back as a senior member of a British government.
Professor John Curtice at the University of Strathclyde, thank you so much, and sorry to cut you short.
You're welcome.